Well, we have a somewhat controversial subject, but we're going to handle it as delicately as possible and refrain from all unnecessary downgrading of the efforts of Mr. Darwin. It seems, however, that in the last 5 or 10 years especially, a conflict has arisen in society which no one really expected. And at the present time, 2 hypotheses concerning the origin of man have come into a collision. This collision course is particularly discomforting to the scientific community because it has been generally assumed throughout the fields of higher education that we were safely, solidly, and serenely Darwinian in our explanations of the origin of human life. To suddenly find that it's not true, or it is being questioned, is a shock which is creating considerable repercussion in various walks of society. Now, the first question we may ask is, why has this particular issue come into focus? I think for one reason, for nearly 100 years, science has been the white hope of the world. We have assumed that science was going to lead us into the golden age, that science was going to bring about world peace, world security, world wealth, that everything was going to go very well, and that there was no need for us to contemplate any spiritual mystery in the background of life. This attitude has changed markedly since the development of nuclear armament. We suddenly begin to question the moral integrities of the scientific hypotheses. We begin to question whether the advancements of science are going to produce the improvements in humanity itself that have been taken for granted down through the years. We are also more or less frustrated in the development of scientific instruments and methodologies. We are now highly involved in the computer and the development of various electronic circuits, etc. All these processes are fascinating to the young, but they do not solve most of the essential problems of humanity. In fact, they ignore them. The computer, instead of contributing perhaps to the solution of human employment, is going to create more unemployment. Progress is a way of substituting machines for people, and these machines will ultimately result in a very tragic lack of employment for the human race itself. Also, scientific development of armaments has become a fear factor in human nature. We are more or less convinced that as the result of scientific progress, we are now in a condition and a position in which we could completely obliterate humanity. Now, this does not sound like progress. It sounds more like annihilation. And we begin to wonder why a highly intelligent strata of humanity is willing to go on like this. Why there seems to be no reason in their thinking to slow down destruction or the causes of it. The entire problem is one in which the mind must do what it pleases, whether it results in confusion, chaos, or destruction. Now, a great many millions of human beings who were very much enamored of science have suddenly questioned it. And unfortunately, the scientific community is not rising in a proper manner to defend its own position. Rather, it has a tendency to ignore the wishes, the will, and the fears of the great majority of human beings. They are not responsive to the cries of millions of frightened neighbors and associates. They go serenely on their way on the grounds that that type of progress is inevitable, that it must come, and that any human being who slows it down is a traitor to progress. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have had a little difficulty also with the religious situation. Religion has gradually tried to creep into science. The religious point of view has finally come head-on into conflict with this scientific materialism. Now, there is a good reason, perhaps, for this, but unfortunately we are also having a little trouble religiously, and the religious difficulties are giving strength and a measure of sufficiency to the scientific difficulties. In other words, if we pick trouble with science, science is in a position to return the compliment. And this is not the way it should be in life. What no one seems to be willing to face at the present time is the simple fact that both the materialistic and the religious attitude towards humanity, both of these attitudes are hypotheses. Science cannot prove its theory any more adequately than religion is able to support its concept of the origin of life. Actually, religion has a little the better of it, but this is not generally recognized. One of the reasons it has the better of it is that the religious point of view is very much older than the scientific. And as we study antiquity and the various systems of knowledge that arose in ancient times and have descended to us today, we find that there has been no major school in the past that has taken the Darwinian attitude. There has been no time in the development of the human ideologies that the concept of man arising from the animal kingdom has received any popular or thoughtful support. It was never part of our great philosophical heritage from the past. Yet we are not in a position to prove that the ancients were unable to arrive at this conclusion if they had wished to do so. The very antiquity that gave us mathematics, astronomy, music, physics, medicine, was certainly in a condition to study the nature of man. And it did. But it never took the turn toward the Darwinian concept. It was never assumed in antiquity that the human being either ascended from or descended from the animal kingdom. Yet the ancient was well aware of animals. He was well aware of the environments in which they existed. He used domesticated animals. He hunted wild animals. And in Alexandria, in Egypt particularly, the zoological gardens made available a very careful study of animal habits and peculiarities. Yet never once among the greater minds of the past has the theory of evolution, as represented by Darwin, taken hold. It was never a method of answering the situation. Antiquity approached the matter in an entirely different way, but it was more or less honest also. Most of the ancients were willing to accept without question that first cause is beyond human comprehension. Now, we may say that this is not true. We may be able to intellectualize a concept of first cause. Antiquity did this. But no matter how it was developed, or how it was supported, or how it was interpreted, it remained an hypothesis. It was an approach to something the substance and essence of which was beyond human comprehension. As science and philosophy and religion all rose together in antiquity and were only separated in a comparatively recent period of time, it is also obvious that the scientific position is also hypothetical. And both conditions are theories. They are postulates and postulations until we are able to answer the questions relating to first cause and answer them successfully. Before we can tell how life operates, we must answer the question, what is life? What is this energy? What is spirit? What is mind? What is consciousness? What is energy? What is force? We all realize that these processes, these aspects of existence exist. But we are not yet in a position to find a dogmatic definition for any of them. The only way we can define them even now is by defining in terms of the consequences of their activities. We do not know what they are, but we are trying to find out, and in some degrees have been successful, in finding out what they do. But their essence is beyond calculation. We are unable, definitely, to discover the essential principles behind existence. We'd like to overlook this and simply deny it. One of the most common scientific attitudes is that when we ask the question why, we should assume that it is the question how. We know how things operate, but we do not know why. We do not know what they are, but we believe we can classify some of the things that they do. As far as the final answer to the mystery of life is concerned, it has eluded us from the beginning. The ancients accepted this truth, namely, that the true and final definition is not available. The complete fact of any of the important questions that we ask, this fact is not available. If we do not know why life exists, what it is, where it came from, why it produces this vast concatenation of forms and creatures, until we get some of these answers, all dogmatism is unreasonable. And yet dogmatism is nearly always based upon ignorance. It is not based upon what we know. It is an effort to defend ourselves against what we do not know. Therefore, today, we have a problem. How did man come into existence? What is the story of life? What is the story of existence? And I think we all acknowledge, definitely, that the development of the concept of evolution has been useful. Evolution was a more or less obvious answer to a problem that is not obvious. Evolution was a neat way of assuming a sequential progress of life through the various forms of nature in an ascending order from the molecular through the mineral, the plant, the animal, and into the human kingdom. Now this seemed to be such a neat and trite statement that it was accepted instantly and presented us with the solution to certain secondary procedures in nature, but nothing to do with primary. Even if we prove conclusively that life moves through these kingdoms in an ascending order, we still do not know what that life is, nor do we know why it ascends through these various levels of expression. Some years ago, a discussion was held concerning the possibility of man being a product of the animal kingdom. That somewhere in the remote past, what was been called the missing link, pictured by a very interesting composition by the artist Gabriel Max, that there was a missing link between man and the animal, and that this link was a bridge, and that across this bridge animals moved to become human. And humanity is more or less an advanced animal creation, and that it has therefore the visible components of an animal existence, but something is different. It has been impossible to prove conclusively to anybody's satisfaction that the inner life of the human being is identical with that of the animal. If we wish to assume another hypothesis, it's true, the unfoldment of form in nature through the various kingdoms as we recognize them, apparently the final purpose of this unfoldment is the creation of bodies, and that these bodies become the vehicles of energies and forces superior to themselves. It is becoming practically untenable in the knowledge that we possess today to assume that the body and the person in the body, that these two constitute one identical being. The body and the person are separate. The person may function through the body and may gradually mold the body into the likeness of its own purposes, but the person and the body are separate beings. Science is reluctant to accept this because to do so would permit the mind to conjure with the thought that if the person is separate from the body, that person can have existence apart from the body. And this is a more or less heretical position in terms of science. It is the opinion of science that the rise and fall of the human being is a complete pattern in itself, that the individual had no existence before his birth and will have none after death. This, however, again, is a hypothetical approach to a problem. No one has yet been able to actually prove that the human being had no existence before birth, and is unable to prove with any conclusiveness that it has any existence after death. For scientifically speaking, however, psychology is producing a wedge, by means of which it is making it obvious that it is conceivable that the person and the body have separate existences, and that what we would call embodiment is the entry of a pre-existing pattern into a material existence. If this is the case, and there seems to be increasing support of this belief, then it would follow that various levels of life would be embodied in various levels of bodies. This again presents the scientist with a problem because he would then have to concatenate life itself. He would have to assume that bodies are symbols of the degree of life that is within them. This would mean that the life in the mineral would be less evolved than the life in a plant, and that the life of an animal would be less evolved than the life of a human being. Thus we would have an evolution of a life through a series of forms or bodies suitable to the expression of that form of life. This constitutes a more or less philosophical approach and more or less agrees with the opinions of antiquity. transmigration, or the entry of human souls into animal bodies, was never generally recognized, and where it was postulated, it was nearly always in the form of punishment. That to be involved in a less than human body would be a punishment for the human being. The Pythagoreans, however, and most of the Orientals accepted the symbolical meaning, namely, that the individual who lived below the level of his own humanity would return not in an animal body physically, but on an animal level of human existence, as an untutored, undisciplined, unmoralized creature. The next point that would come into focus then would have to be what the theologian is concerned about, namely, what is it that moves through these bodies? Is there a life that moves through races, nations, creatures, orders of existence, like a thread moving through a string of beads? Is there one life behind all apparent diversities of life? Some theologians, including Aquinas, have been of the opinion that there is only one life, and that finally and ultimately that life is the life of deity. That there is only one source of life and one source of universal energy, and that is this intangible, mysterious being or power or principle which we call God. Now, science has no substitute for this concept. Some scientists have attempted to explain the matter by assuming that life in its own nature is eternal, has no beginning and no end, that there never was a creation of the divine principle of things, which was a kind of great sea of eternal energy in which everything exists, has existed, and will exist throughout eternity. This, however, does not satisfy a number of human concerns, because this one energy has to in some way be conditioned, or various types of living things could not emerge from it. So it has been generally assumed by the more thoughtful of the philosophically minded people that in truth and substance a divine being consisting of complete unconditioned consciousness, intelligence, and energy has been at the source of existence. What this is in absolute definition, we do not know, but we find it possible, convenient, and almost inevitable to regard it as deity, the one final, ultimate fact of existence. Now, in order to determine the nature of deity, we would have to, in one way or another, become aware of its own existence and the purposes and motions which are innate in it. This brings us into philosophical speculations, which also are a little difficult for modern science to accept. The problem is that to science, the ultimate is a completely impersonal energy. To the theologian, the ultimate is a purposed conscious energy. It is something that is alive and meaningful and purposeful. It is not like the gasoline in a fuel tank, something simply to be used to move a machine. This life is the sovereignty of all things, and we can go back to Pythagoras to try and find out something about ancient knowledge on this subject. To the Pythagoreans, and in their school of thinking, there is, and always has been, only one life in space. This one life in space manifests through an infinity of differentiations, with everything that is conceivable or unconceivable to man is part of the potential of this one life. This one life is all and one. All as the total of everything that exists, In one life, all things live and move and have their being. This one life cannot be analyzed by any of the fragments of itself, but it is the source of all fragmentation. This one life is not only the source of all bodies, but of minds, of souls, of spirits, and of every type of differentiation that exists in space. This one life, then, is the totality of all of the manifestations of itself, plus the nature of its own identity, which is known only to itself. Now, if we would approach this on this type of level of thought, we probably would not require any kind of a major conflict between religion and science, because it would begin with the simple realization that neither has the full knowledge, that neither science nor religion actually has the full understanding of the mystery of existence. There are two polarities involved here. Science searching for reality from the outside, religion searching for reality from the inside. To the religious person, the experience of faith is all important. To the scientist, the experience of fact is all important. But faith, in a strange way, is more available on the universal level than fact. The moment we go into the study of fact, we go against the great wall of matter. We can explore the universe scientifically only on the plane of physical existence. We can send probes further and further into space, but no matter how far we go, there will still be space, and we will not know why it is there or what its purpose is. On the other hand, if we use faith and search more and more deeply into ourselves for the answer, we discover by a mystical experience or an apperception from within our own natures, we discover certain convictions, certain feelings, certain sensory reactions, which all add up to a sense of great believing, of faith, and also the realization that this mysterious thing called ultimate knowledge is not actually necessary to us. Being imperfect creatures in our own ways, being incomplete, the full knowledge of completeness would not be suitable to our needs. What we need always is to search inside in quest of the knowledge of that which we are now and what we must do about it in order to fulfill the destiny that we understand within the span of our own existence. Science is not so emotionally involved in this matter, except on a level of debate. But the scientific point of view is that when we conquer the physical universe, we can achieve our final liberation from ignorance. The difficulty in this point of view is that there seems to be no probability that we are going to conquer the universe. What we call conquering is merely exploring and creating of hypotheses. Whatever we discover leads to another discovery, but the reality eludes us all. So science is content to go on exploring the physical dimensions of the universe, and would like this to be passed on as the proper purpose for education in our public school systems. Namely, that we are to respect facts above all other considerations. The religionist rather takes the attitude we should respect values above all other considerations. Now, the scientific point of view has greater strength or validity if we wish to take the scientific position that the survival of life after death is an illusion. If the individual, at the end of his present life, ceases forever, and there is nothing to be gained by any idealism or any effort to release values within himself which do not have any existence except in his own mind, if this is true, then the conquest of the material becomes the sole objective of humanity. It can do no more than try to write a full description of the physical existence in which it exists. The scientific point of view, then, would impel us to advance various forms of sciences, some of which are very useful, some of which are not very useful. But the final answer is not just the scientific fact, it is utility. It is the value of it in use. If you remove from scientific progress moral integrities, you get into a very serious condition. Knowledge without integrity is deadly. No matter what skills we possess or develop, if we are not motivated to the proper use of them, and not impelled by some power within ourselves to avoid the misuse or abuse of these discoveries, we will gradually undermine existence and destroy the forms of life which we have inherited from the past. So there is something necessary, and this necessary element is a communion between science and idealism. Idealism's principal exponent at the present time is religion. Religion is that factor in our behavior pattern by which we are motivated to the proper use of that which we know. As materialistic education lowers morality, we perceive in daily living the consequences. We are moving into an era of crime and corruption practically unknown in history. We have taken away from the individual the censorship of integrities. We have taken for granted that it is not whether we are good or bad that is important. It is which side has the heaviest artillery. And physical strength and the cunning to create it are the all-important elements of survival. This is simply untrue. These are the dangers which hazard survival. Now, if we could come to a mutual understanding with religion and science, in which the two decide to work together, science probing and bestowing upon religion the dignified right of interpreting all discoveries in terms of human good. If, however, science continues to ridicule religious conviction, or downgrade it, or consider it an interference with progress, then we are going to be in the position in which one day we're going to have a head-on collision between science and religion. And in this headlong collision, I think science will lose. It will lose because the collision will not occur until science itself has abused its privileges and made life practically unendurable for the human being. Also, progress exploited for profit, a partnership between knowledge and wealth. This is again disconcerting and discouraging to the average individual. So there is very much to believe that the rapid increase of interest in religious thinking is largely motivated by the fact that science is inventing a kind of progress with which the human being cannot cope and which will ultimately result in a general destruction. Science has to become moralistic. It has to place censorship upon itself. It has to apply to its own achievements a golden rule of integrities. And in order to answer the question, why integrities? The scientific, industrialized, economic community has another problem on its hands. Is it necessary for the scientist to accept theology in order to correct the processes now in action? Technically, no. It is not necessary for the scientist to become a theologian in order to recognize moral responsibility. All the scientist has to do is give a long, careful look at the consequence of what he's doing. If he can stop for a moment in his progress and realize what he is doing to humanity and not what he is doing for humanity, a great change could result. It is obvious that the present course is a headlong course towards the deification of a planet that is nothing more than a battlefield. So we have this problem constantly, that a scientist can be a person of integrity. He is very likely already a person of integrity in his personal life. He may be a good family man, a good parent, a sincere son. These things are quite probable. But it is necessary for him to realize that the mind within him must be subject to something stronger than itself. And science is not sure that it believes that there is anything stronger, and is inclined to assume that the moral equation in his own nature is simply an emotional reaction to personal feelings. Actually now we are going to have some further delineations of these matters in the public school system. Those who are religiously minded want the theory of creation to be taught to students. The scientific community wants the theory of evolution, particularly the Darwinian form, to be the basis of human instruction. For a large measure, this entire thing is a tempest in a teapot, for the reason that neither side is in a position to scientifically prove its point, and all decision must be in terms of the greater good to the greater number. That which accomplishes the most to advance the ideals, purposes, and constructive concerns of humanity should have precedence. What does the Darwinian theory give us, or give young children who must face a life of international conflict, political corruption, economic uncertainty, and social decline? What does the Darwinian theory do to help those going to school to build lives that are purposeful? The purpose of education is to teach the human being to use the knowledge of his race. If he does not use it, is not impelled to use it, is not inspired to use it, then education fails. And if by a mistaken attitude he accepts, learns, and uses that which is destructive to the common good, he becomes a menace rather than a benefit to the world. Therefore, what has the scientific theory of evolution going to do to the person who is going out to make a living? What is it going to do to him to be a materialist, to decline to accept as superstition anything that is not obvious to his five senses and the scientific community? The answer is it's going to do him very little good. He will never find security in any of the advancements of science. One thing it can do for him, and that is, it can help him to protect, preserve, and use the body that he has. But even this is hazarded by many kinds of selfishness on the part of the intellectual group. Theoretically, science can help us, but it can help us principally on the level of body. It can help us to use the structure that we have and to repair it if it is in danger of sickness or dissolution. It can help. But as far as the scientific point of view, giving us personal integrity, giving us happiness in our homes, giving us better-oriented children, and a willingness to cooperate for a common good. It does not help us to solve international conflicts. It does not help us to improve political relationships. It does not make our statesmen more honest. It does not make our citizens more frugal or cooperative. All of these things are outside of the scientific domain. They are assumed, as one biologist told me, that the scientist is a teacher of the public and private morals depend upon individuals themselves. This is a very poor answer to a very immediate question. As the depression increases, as unemployment rises, as human securities are threatened, what is science doing to meet the emergency? It is going to continue what it has always done, to advance scientific skills and try to convince us that if it can put a man on Pluto, that all is well in the world. This is very attractive to juveniles who have a great respect for Superman and all of these scientific robots that are being fashioned in the entertainment world. But down to the solid facts of life, no science is important or valuable until it is ensouled. Ensouling the science means its dedication to the service of human need. Science does not exist to glorify itself. It does not exist to create profit for corporations. Science exists primarily to improve humanity's relationship with itself on the levels of family, home, health, and other problems. Science must be ensouled, or soullessly it will destroy itself. Now, on the other side of the coin, what are we going to do about the religious group? It is interesting to realize that we often say that the scientist, particularly the scientific community, is the only international, interracial body that we have. It does not make much difference whether you live in a kingdom, a democracy, or a communist state. Biologists get together from all these different points of view and do their research programs. They share knowledge, they research projects, and they pay practically no attention to the political and social relationships of the communities in which they live. They are therefore regarded as a super group, a group welcome in China or Russia or France or Italy, wherever they may be. Now, religion has one difficulty in this particular point. Religion has not yet been able to consolidate its own strength. Religion has not yet come to the realization of the unity of the concept of God. Religions still have interpretations that are in conflict. Now, conflict in interpretation is due largely to the absence of basic fact, or it can arise from language differences or from social and climatic differences. But regardless of the origin, the various parts of the religious community cannot cooperate effectively, or at least they do not cooperate at the present time. Therefore, we have several major world religions, all dedicated to the same moral and social ends, all very largely worshiping the same concepts of divinity and its operations in creation, yet unable to meet upon any common ground. And why this inability to meet? It is the result of a long traditional theological structure in which each faith firmly believes that it was predestined and foreordained to rule the world. Now, this type of situation is the great weakness of religion. religion has not yet been able to break through a peculiar physical belief that really should have long ago passed into the keeping of science. Namely, that it is perfectly possible to consider deity simply to be an expanded, unfolded, dramatized form of human being. The deities of the past were deified mortals, or at least had this general appearance. We have not yet come to the realization of the nature of the ultimate cause of things. Science doesn't know what it is, and theology doesn't know what it is. Theology has been locked in theological structures which have differed as to the nature of God sufficiently to create creeds, sects, and religious divisions. Science has not been any more successful, and here are the two groups. Science trying to get out of the dilemma by denying the existence of conflict, and religion trying to get out of the dilemma by continually warring in order that one can control the others. So we have a little problem here that comes down to our personal living in a great many cases. Here we are as individuals in a world of which our bodies are largely dominated by science and our hearts and minds largely inclined toward religion. And in the midst of this situation is this grave question at the moment, a question that has really very little significance, as to the nature of our own essential beings. What is man, says the Scripture, that thou shalt be mindful of him? Well, what is man? What is humanity? Scientifically, he is merely a precocious biped without feathers. According to theology, he is the noblest production of deity. Actually, what is the human being and how should he view himself? If he doesn't respect his own nature, if he doesn't have any convictions that are worthwhile, how can he regulate and control and direct his own life? In looking around into the animal kingdom which surrounds us, we observe that between the human being and the animal, there is an incredible, insurmountable obstacle. There is no way of assuming that the human being is simply a highly sophisticated animal. When we study the animal kingdom, we come into a realization that if the animal had the same potential faculties and powers that we have, he would have run humanity off the planet long ago. We are outnumbered by everything from bees to ants and major quadrupeds. We are a minority group in a vast system of life. We are yet in a unique position. One of the reasons for our misunderstandings, I think, has been our tendency to humanize the animal. In other words, we talk to cats and dogs. Probably they may understand some of it. Perhaps, however, it isn't the talk they understand. Perhaps they have a psychic integration that gets the message. Many of them are very faithful to humanity. And yet between man and the animal there are certain differences which is impossible to cross. One of these differences is thought. The individual power of the mind. In order to be human, the individual has memory. He has also the power mentally of projecting a future, which gives him the privilege to improve, change, and modify his own existence. The human being is the only creature that we know in the visible world which is capable of self-directive, that is capable of dominating a situation, and most of all, of verbalizing it.
Speech has separated man from the animal from the beginning. And while the animal is a very lovable and wonderful creature in many instances, it is not right either to us or to the animal for us to assume that we are directly bound to them by a biological factor. Let us assume then the fact as it is, that two orders of evolution are working at the same time in nature. One is physical evolution. Here Mr. Darwin had something on his mind, and he really made an important contribution. In other words, nature is continually unfolding bodies, and these bodies move from one degree of efficiency to another, and the most efficient and complex and useful physical body ever created is that of the human being. In the human being there are potentials which are latent in all lesser animal or plant, vegetable, mineral forms. Physical evolution is producing nobler mansions, but there is not anything to indicate here that this physical evolution does control that which is in the body. The ancients would have agreed, largely, that evolution of form is inevitable and proper, but that the evolution of life through form is a separate function. That which form makes possible, the house that form builds, has its proper occupant. And each order of life is a level of internal life development and unfoldment. Therefore, what we call the human being is not the body, but the life moving through that body. A life which has fashioned gradually the form we call human through long periods of evolution, and a life which adjusts the new body with each embodiment to the needs and characteristics and qualities of its own purposes. Therefore, the higher form of evolution is the evolution of life. The lower form is the evolution of bodies. These two work together. And each time an embodiment occurs, that which enters in belongs to the proper level of life. Only the human being can enter into the human form because of the unfoldment and evolvement of its superphysical structure. Therefore, we think of it and refer to it very often theologically as man being a body ensouled. And it is the soul in the body that makes it human. And it is the human soul that makes the human being possible. It is the animal soul that makes the animal possible. Both points of view have certain integrities, but to attempt to unite them and assume that the body and the dweller in the flesh, that these are identical, is against practically every system of rationalistic thinking the world has ever created. The human being is human and is born and bred by human parents and receives its gift of a human life spark. And this humanity is that which inhabits the body after the quickening and gradually molds it into the purposes of the incarnating entity. The body is definitely traceable back through all the forms of life that have been found before. And psychologically, we can trace the life principle back through the various levels of life. But unfortunately, we are unable to experience directly any level of life except our own. We cannot relive the life of a plant or an animal, because actually we are not part of those kingdoms. But we can, from an outward study of the forms of these creatures, understand something of the life in them because this life is manifested in their functions and in their processes and in the circumstances which they impel into existence. Therefore, it would seem that religion and philosophy are especially related to the person in the body, the being that is in the flesh, whereas the body itself is a proper subject for physical scientific consideration. It can be helped, it can be more valuable in its needs, it can be served by the physical. Science can help to make the house better for the person dwelling in it. But no matter how much it improves the house, it cannot control, direct, or dominate the life of the occupant, because the occupant has an entirely different level of function. Actually, we also have a tendency in trying to understand these things of assuming that all forms of consciousness in nature are identical with our own. This is probably an erroneous conclusion. What we call consciousness is our own experience of the function of the life principle within us. For us, consciousness expresses itself through the ego, through the mind, through the emotions, through the vital resources of the body. And it is this dweller in the flesh that helps us to choose our careers, that helps us to decide and evaluate experiences, and this factor helps us to grow inwardly through the internalization of things that happen in our environment. In other words, the purpose of the body is to help the power in the body to become more and more sufficient to its own needs. If, for instance, the body gets into difficulties, as for instance in drug addiction, the being in the body must accept the challenge of this and either produce its own remedy. It must rise above this delinquency. It must learn to know the troubles that result from such addictions. And failing to note these things, it finally passes out of life, destroyed by its own weakness, selfishness, or misunderstanding. Now again, science says when it leaves, that's all there is to it. This again is contrary to every legitimate purpose of a natural phenomenon, that the individual, having passed through a whole variety of experiences, should then disappear forever, cease to exist, and have no future being of any kind. This seems to be a position that cannot be tolerated philosophically. This brings philosophy into focus as the power to bring together the scientific and the religious points of view. As philosophy becomes the reconciler of opposites, it becomes, in a sense, the mediator between all extremes in life. All philosophy worthy of the name, and it's not too abundant at the present time, all philosophy deals with the problem of adequate purpose. Things that happen for a reason. There is no waste motion in life. There are no occurrences that are meaningless. Everything has significance of some kind. Everything that happens in the outer life affects the inner person within that body. Every attitude, every contact with society modifies the pattern of the person in the body. When the time comes for the person and the body to separate, the person survives. And more, even the scientific communion is beginning to assume the possibility of life after death. Life after death was accepted by our most primitive ancestors. It has always been known intuitively as part of our eternal realities. But up to recently, it has been considered unscientific. Perhaps because, as One prominent educator said of it that that philosophy and idealism was a sickly mysticism that interfered with the glory of facts. Well, the glory of facts look rather shabby at the moment. The glory is not noticeable. But the fact of the matter is that unless we are here for a purpose, the entire existence of living things has no meaning whatsoever. And having no meaning, there is no hope. For if there is no meaning, no reason, no methodology by which anything can be accomplished, then we live and die in a state of complete bewilderment and have been exploited from the cradle to the grave. Such is not the case, fortunately, for all concerned. And it is obvious that the experiences of a lifetime are not kept in record in the body alone. The body does not know anything about how we felt about our neighbors, except that when we feel wrongly about our neighbors, the body knows something is wrong. But it does not gain moral instruction from the happenings of the person in the body. But the vibration of the person in the body, if it becomes better and higher, does elevate gradually the bodily elements and puts the bodily cells into an inhabitable universe of their own. It prevents the destruction of the multitude forms of life within our own flesh. If we then assume, as is almost necessary, that there is something beyond the present, then in a large measure the whole structure of science falls apart. Because if there is something more in life or to life than the immediate frenzied accumulation of wealth or power, then we have been living falsely from the beginning, and science has been trying to build up something that cannot survive. It is therefore very important for us to try to ensoul the world in which we live. And I think that really, of the animals and other kingdoms of nature, man becomes symbolically a conscious ensoulment of life, as this ensoulment develops on this level of existence. In other words, man represents more or less a soul power in the material world. The power of inner consciousness, inner dedication, inner understanding and realization to transmute and transform the outer environment into an appropriate and proper place for the development of life. The human being has tremendous potentials. These potentials include a number of faculties, not only of communication, but of memory, of ideation, of internal mysticism. It makes possible the rise of esoteric disciplines, sciences, and philosophies. It definitely indicates that gradually the human being is able to take over his own destiny. This is something that sets him entirely apart from every other kingdom of nature. There is no other kingdom that we know that can create a future destiny for itself by intent, that can take the rough materials of life and ensoul them with purposes beyond survival. The other kingdoms are largely tied into a survival pattern, which is always present, is always dominant, and requires practically the entire life of the living creature. The animal kingdoms live in one or two principles alone. They have to feed, they must have nutrition, and they have to generate and reproduce. Food and reproductive power constitute the burden which all kingdoms below man must carry. Now, this doesn't mean that man doesn't have to carry them also, but it means that man is capable of a complete life above them. The human being is not required to spend all of his life feeding himself and that alone, nor is he required to exist only to the point of generation or perpetuation of species and then an immediate departure. The human being has other overtones which must be developed or can be developed by the proper aptitudes and the proper dedications. The human being has a life fulfillment within itself. It has a duty to itself, which is another form of nutrition. Man's material nature perpetuates the species. Man's soul perpetuates and unfolds itself by a psychic nutrition, the nutrition of ideals, of dreams, of hopes, of aspirations, and of dedications. As the old story of the Greek banquet tells us, there is food for the body, but there is also the banquet of the soul, a kind of holy communion in which the individual nourishes the inner life by the merits of its own conduct, by its dreams, its aspirations, and its dedications. So that this means definitely that the human being was created or fashioned or evolved, or whatever you want to call it, for a purpose that is unique in nature. It is because of this uniqueness in nature that the human being controls or is capable of controlling every other form of life. It cannot create another form of life, but it can direct it, unfold its resources, it can curb it or expand it, it can give it greater opportunity or destroy its privileges. The human being is in a strange way, is the leader of this herd of souls that we find embodied in the kingdoms of nature. Therefore, man is a unique creature. It is not possible to assume that we can explain man merely as an animal with one step further ahead. It is not only this, it is a completely different organization, not physically, but because it contains within it a being more highly devolved and developed than any other creature that has created a visible likeness among us. Man has the tremendous advantage of being capable of creating not only materially but spiritually. Not only generating forms but generating ideas, capable of reproduction in an internal spiritual sense of that term. Because of this, the individual also has appropriate responsibilities. He is faced with the duties of his own identity. If his duties were simply to feed and generate, we'd have no little problem, because animals don't have too much problems of this nature. They have their territories and they abide by them and they follow laws and instincts which are immutable. Man is not a servant of instincts that he is unable to direct or control. The human being is a self-moving mechanism. It is a being capable of unfolding higher levels than any other kingdom that we know. But in order to do this, the individual must have some motivation. And our school children need motivation. Young people today and older folks too need some form of motivation which will enable them to live above and beyond physical pressures. To lock the soul within the body after it has been given dominion over it is a sad mistake. And yet in most people, the soul is merely an energy which is a servant of desires, ambitions, and personal feelings. The soul is not being permitted to perform its essential duty of directing the life within the person and protecting the body in which that life is enclosed. So man has to improve from within out. He has to lead from the soul and not from the body. He has to use the mind and emotions to advance the universal good and not merely to further little small selfish projects of his own. Yet if we are so educated that little things are all that we ever learn of, if it is assumed that importance simply consists in doing what we please, then we have missed the entire purpose of our existence. Nature, however, is not going to be frustrated so easily. If the individual or a generation or a race or a species fails completely in its purposes, nature simply eliminates it. We have lost the dinosaurs, we have lost the megatheriums and the brontosauruses because they were no longer useful, because they contributed nothing to the plans and purposes of life. We are watching species and types fading away today because they have no further need for the experience of this environment. Man, however, has not achieved a diploma of graduation. He is not, as yet, using his potentials and his purposes correctly. And young people should be told this. They should not be so much concerned as to where they came from in terms of the Darwinian theory, but where they're going in terms of cosmic purpose. This is the emphasis. Every young person should be taught the dignity of his own contribution to life. He should be taught that there is within him something that he can use to better others and serve himself in this way. That he is not here simply to get rich or powerful. He is not going to be a success because he is a computer operator. He is here to grow not only in skills but in grace. And his skills should be under the domination of his integrities. The more proficient he becomes in some line of activity, the greater the contribution he can make to enduring good, not merely to some passing project that seems to have economic possibilities. We have great need to give young people reason for life. And today this idea of trying to create an arbitration between the theory of generation and the theory of creation and let the children decide which to follow is not very practical, for the reason that the average child can't decide. They have not the experience, they have not the background. It seems to me that the arbitration lies on an entirely different level. Namely, that the purpose of science is to invent and discover. The purpose of religion is to learn to use wisely and unselfishly all the skills of mankind. Therefore, religion is involved in the use of that which science may claim to discover. Religion makes things valuable to the survival of life on this planet. Knowledge is increasing very rapidly, but unless integrity grows with it, we cannot depend upon a livable future. So maybe it would be just as well to not try to force which one is correct, but to point out that each of these courses of action, creation and generation, each has a practical, visual, and moral term which it can fulfill. Therefore, that instead of trying to decide which is the best of them, let us form a partnership between the two concepts. Let science keep on exploring, and let religion or philosophy apply what is found to the common good. But if science insists that any constructive use of its discoveries is an interference with the right of discovery, then we are in trouble again. It should be that whatever science finds, it should allow human experience to apply for the common good. It is useless to assume that integrity is an interference with progress. It is not. It is the integrity that makes change progress. And without integrity, change is nothing. We can add all we want to the so-called skills of mankind. But if these skills are not ennobled by purpose, all is in vain. And there is no reason why the scientist who likes to explore and discover should not even more greatly rejoice when he realizes that what he is discovering is going to be used for the good of mankind. And if that enjoyment and that power does not arise in his own thinking, then he is not a safe citizen of the world. If he does not want what he invents to be used well, he should not be permitted to carry on these projects. And if it becomes necessary, because of his own misuse of knowledge, to put some censorship upon these matters, then it is for his good as well as for the good of others. For the scientist who goes on with his nuclear research may live to see it destroy his own children. This type of situation is not good. Materialism has always been faced with it, and religion has always come forward to meet this emergency. And the greatly increasing interest in religion that we have at the present time is the result of the fact that progress as we know it is becoming too dangerous, and that unless it is curbed in some way, unless some form of inner reality comes into existence, we are all in trouble. And both religion and philosophy suspect profoundly that this tremendous energy, which we call life, this power that makes all things possible, is not a blind force, that it is also a conscious moral energy, and that all energy has in its very substance and essence a soul factor. It is an ensouled energy which creates. It is an ensouled energy which generates. And if energy is used by created creatures or generated beings against the use of its own proper values, energy itself can revolt. And energy itself can remove itself from that which abuses it, or falsely uses it, or corrupts it, or perverts it. So that little by little, the tremendous censorship of the infinite comes upon us. And in order to meet that censorship with integrity, I think we have to realize that man is a living soul, that his body is of the earth, to which it will return. But his soul belongs to a higher order of life, which is moving triumphantly toward the perfection and service of the divine plan. We live in these two levels. We must balance them within ourselves. And if one is to gain advantage over the other, it must be the power of the soul to win the body, to take the body and make it an instrument of the purpose of that divine part of man, which is his hope of glory. If we can begin to think these things through, we will not be impractical, but we will realize that a practical philosophy of life must justify life, must make it meaningful and worthwhile, must make also a program, a progress, which we can all share and all labor together for the common good. If we take these points into consideration, we probably can make a comparative link between science and religion. That we will render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's, and that includes body, wealth, physical environment, but also at the same time can render unto God the things that are His. And if we want to assume that the material world belongs to the deities of the underlife, at the same time that there is a superior world, and man, as a creature, has been endowed with the power to know this. And of all the creatures that we know, man alone has the hope of a greater destiny. He is the one being who is able to change all things for the good. And if he does not use this energy, there is stagnation. If he perverts it, there is disintegration. It is a part of our plan to realize that man is not an animal. Man is a being dedicated to the service of that which his inner life has revealed to him. And if he makes proper use of this inner life, his outer life will be orderly, proper, and constructive. If we control the negative factors of our own dispositions, we can live in a world in peace with each other and in harmony with the divine purpose. Well, I guess that's it, folks.
From the past. Yet we are not in a position to prove that the ancients were unable to arrive at this conclusion if they had wished to do so. The very antiquity that gave us mathematics, astronomy, music, physics, medicine, was certainly in a condition to study the nature of man. And it did. But it never took the turn toward the Darwinian concept. It was never assumed in antiquity that the human being either ascended from or descended from the animal kingdom. Yet the ancient was well aware of animals. He was well aware of the environments in which they existed. He used domesticated animals. He hunted wild animals. And in Alexandria, in Egypt particularly, the zoological gardens made available a very careful study of animal habits and peculiarities. Yet never once among the greater minds of the past has the theory of evolution, as represented by Darwin, taken hold. It was never a method of answering the situation. Antiquity approached the matter in an entirely different way, but it was more or less honest also. Most of the ancients were willing to accept without question that first cause is beyond human comprehension. Now we may say that this is not true. We may be able to intellectualize a concept of first cause. Antiquity did this. But no matter how it was developed, or how it was supported, or how it was interpreted, it remained an hypothesis. It was an approach to something, the substance and essence of which was beyond human comprehension. As science and philosophy and religion all rose together in antiquity, and were only separated in a comparatively recent period of time, it is also obvious that the scientific position is also hypothetical. And both conditions are theories. They are postulates and postulations until we are able to answer the questions relating to first cause and answer them successfully. Before we can tell how life operates, we must answer the question, what is life? What is this energy? What is spirit? What is mind? What is consciousness? What is energy? What is force? We all realize that these processes, these aspects of existence exist. But we are not yet in a position to find a dogmatic definition for any of them. The only way we can define them even now is by defining in terms of the consequences of their activities. We do not know what they are, but we are trying to find out, and in some degrees have been successful, in finding out what they do. But their essence is beyond calculation. We are unable, definitely,
to discover the essential principles behind existence. We'd like to overlook this and simply deny it. One of the most common scientific attitudes is that when we ask the question why, we should assume that it is the question how. We know how things operate, but we do not know why. We do not know what they are, but we believe we can classify some of the things that they do. As far as the final answer to the mystery of life is concerned, it has eluded us from the beginning. The ancients accepted this truth, namely, that the true and final definition is not available. The complete fact of any of the important questions that we ask, this fact is not available. If we do not know why life exists, what it is, where it came from, why it produces this vast concatenation of forms and creatures, until we get some of these answers, all dogmatism is unreasonable. And yet dogmatism is nearly always based upon ignorance. Movements in humanity itself that have been taken for granted down through the years. We are also more or less frustrated in the development of scientific instruments and methodologies. We are now highly involved in the computer and the development of various electronic circuits, etc. All these processes are fascinating to the young, but they do not solve most of the essential problems of humanity. In fact, they ignore them. The computer, instead of contributing perhaps to the solution of human employment, is going to create more unemployment. Progress is a way of substituting machines for people, and these machines will ultimately result in a very tragic lack of employment for the human race itself. Also, scientific development of armaments has become a fear factor in human nature. We are more or less convinced that as the result of scientific progress, we are now in a condition and a position in which we could completely obliterate humanity. Now, this does not sound like progress. It sounds more like annihilation. And we begin to wonder why a highly intelligent strata of humanity is willing to go on like this. Why there seems to be no reason in their thinking to slow down destruction or the causes of it. The entire problem is one in which the mind must do what it pleases, whether it results in confusion, chaos, or destruction. Now, a great many millions of human beings who were very much enamored of science have suddenly questioned it. And unfortunately, the scientific community is not rising in a proper manner to defend its own position. Rather, it has a tendency to ignore the wishes, the will, and the fears of the great majority of human beings. They are not responsive to the cries of millions of frightened neighbors and associates. They go serenely on their way on the grounds that that type of progress is inevitable, that it must come, and that any human being who slows it down is a traitor to progress. Now, on the other side of the coin, we have had a little difficulty also with the religious situation. Religion has gradually tried to creep into science. The religious point of view has finally come head-on into conflict with this scientific materialism. Now, there is a good reason, perhaps, for this, but unfortunately, we are also having a little trouble religiously, and the religious difficulties are giving strength and a measure of sufficiency to the scientific difficulties. In other words, if we pick trouble with science, science is in a position to return the compliment. And this is not the way it should be in life. What no one seems to be willing to face at the present time is the simple fact that both the materialistic and the religious attitude towards humanity, both of these attitudes are hypotheses. Science cannot prove its theory any more adequately than religion is able to support the concept of the origin of life. Actually, religion has a little the better of it, but this is not generally recognized. One of the reasons it has the better of it is that the religious point of view is very much older than the scientific. And as we study antiquity and the various systems of knowledge that arose in ancient times and have descended to us today, we find that there has been no major school in the past that has taken the Darwinian attitude. There has been no time in the development of the human ideologies that the concept of man arising from the animal kingdom has received any popular or thoughtful support. It was never part of our great philosophical heritage.
Well, we have a somewhat controversial subject, but we're going to handle it as delicately as possible and refrain from all unnecessary downgrading of the efforts of Mr. Darwin. It seems, however, that in the last 5 or 10 years especially, a conflict has arisen in society which no one really expected. And at the present time, two hypotheses concerning the origin of man have come into a collision. This collision course is particularly discomforting to the scientific community because it has been generally assumed throughout the fields of higher education that we were safely, solidly, and serenely Darwinian in our explanations of the origin of human life. To suddenly find that it's not true, or it is being questioned, is a shock which is creating considerable repercussion in various walks of society. Now, the first question we may ask is, why has this particular issue come into focus? I think for one reason, for nearly 100 years, science has been the white hope of the world. We have assumed that science was going to lead us into the golden age, that science was going to bring about world peace, world security, world wealth, that everything was going to go very well, and that there was no need for us to contemplate any spiritual mystery in the background of life. This attitude has changed markedly since the development of nuclear armament. We suddenly begin to question the moral integrities of the scientific hypotheses. We begin to question whether the advancements of science are going to produce the improvement